The first time Georgia Whitlow saw the McCade ranch, the morning sun seemed to burn straight through her thin cotton dress, as if revealing every secret she carried. Dust shimmered around her boots, swirling in a tired wind that smelled of old cedar and yesterday's bread. She clutched a small sack to her chest, everything she owned stitched into one faded piece of cloth, and wondered how a woman like her ended up standing at the gates of a man like Dustin McCade. 2 months she had been here, and still, she felt like a guest who might be asked to leave at any moment. Dustin never said so, he hardly said anything, but silence carried weight in the Wild West, and Georgia had grown used to hearing everything that wasn't spoken. She had been raised to survive on the shadows between words. The truth was simple. Dustin had expected her sister, Willow. Beautiful, charming Willow, who turned heads the way wind bends tall grass. Willow with her perfect posture, her soft curls, her unbroken heart. She was the one the McCade family had agreed to hire as a cook. She was the one townsfolk whispered about, predicting she'd marry rich someday. She was the one men noticed without trying. But Willow had refused to go. And Georgia, plain and quiet Georgia, had been sent in her place by a father, who did not look her in the eyes when he handed her the travel money. "Work hard," he'd muttered. "Make yourself useful." Useful, never wanted, never chosen. That word still clung to Georgia's ribs like a bruise as she stepped through Dustin's gate that morning with a fresh basket of eggs, her apron already dusted with flour. Ranch life demanded early hours, and she gladly served them. Exhaustion kept her from thinking too much. The air was still cool when she approached the porch, but she could already hear Dustin's boots pacing against the wooden planks above. He always started his day that way. Slow, steady steps, like a man trying to keep himself moving so the past wouldn't catch him. Georgia didn't know what hurt him, only that it lived in his posture, in the way he avoided looking too long at anything that mattered. When she lifted her eyes, she found him standing at the doorway, half-shirt, sunlight cutting across the scars on his arms like pale lightning. Dustin McCade had the kind of presence that made a person straighten instinctively, as though he carried the expectations of an entire county on his back. Yet his gaze was never harsh, only heavy, as though weighted with the memory of storms he'd walked through alone. "Morning," he said quietly. Georgia nodded, adjusting the basket. "Eggs are fresh. I'll have breakfast done within the hour." He stepped aside to let her pass. Their shoulders didn't touch, but the nearness of him sent a warmth through her chest she hadn't invited and certainly didn't trust. For 2 months they had lived like strangers connected by routine. She cooking, he working the land, both pretending nothing unspoken lingered beneath the surface. Inside the house, the scent of pine floors mixed with the fading smoke of last night's fire. Georgia tied on her apron and began cracking eggs one by one into a bowl, letting the rhythm calm her heartbeat. Cooking was the only place she felt steady. The rest of her life had been a patchwork of other people's decisions, but in the kitchen, her hands finally obeyed only her. She whisked eggs, melted butter, diced onions, listening to the quiet creak of Dustin's boots as he moved through the house. He wasn't a man who filled space with noise. His presence spoke in the shifting of floorboards. In the subtle way he paused near the kitchen doorway before continuing on, as if remembering something he meant to say, but didn't. She wished, sometimes, that he would speak. But silence had always been safer for her. Words could wound sharper than blades. As she slid bacon into a pan, the scent of smoke rose in soft, curling strands. It reminded her of Sunday mornings back home, her mother humming before she died, Willow laughing in the yard, her father's boots, the sharp voice that followed Georgia everywhere. Not enough. Never quite enough. Here in Dustin's home, she sometimes forgot that voice. But then the memories returned like dust blown under the door. Georgia plated the food carefully, arranging the portions evenly on 2 dishes. When she set Dustin's plate at the table, she felt his eyes on her. He stood a short distance away, arms crossed loosely, face unreadable. "You've been up since before dawn," he noted. "I don't mind working early," she said, lowering her gaze. "It keeps things running smooth." He studied her a second longer, too long for comfort, then pulled out his chair and sat. Georgia took the chair opposite, but kept her hands folded tightly in her lap. Eating with him always made her feel as though she didn't belong at the same table. But Dustin ate quietly, without judgment. He chewed slowly, swallowed, and finally spoke. "This is good," he said, and something in his voice softened. "Really good." Georgia felt the words settle inside her, warm and bewildering. Compliments were rare in her life. She didn't know how to hold them. "Thank you," she whispered. They ate the rest of the meal in silence, but it was a different kind of silence, less sharp, more like the hush before a sunrise breaks open. When the plates were empty, Georgia gathered them, her hands steady, but her chest trembling with something unnamed. Dustin rose from his chair, hesitated, then cleared his throat. "Georgia, if you need anything." She froze mid-step. He didn't finish the sentence. Instead, he nodded once, a gesture so simple yet so careful it almost broke her. She returned the nod, unsure how to breathe. Outside, the wind shifted. A new day unfurled across the ranch, quiet, expectant, waiting. And Georgia sensed, without knowing why, that something in her life had just begun to turn. Georgia had learned long ago that a woman could be torn apart without ever being touched. All it took was a well-placed whisper, a glance exchanged between two gossiping tongues, a rumor shaped like a knife. And in a small western town where boredom bred cruelty, whispers spread faster than wildfire over dry sage. By the end of her 3rd month on the McCade Ranch, Georgia had become the center of a story she never wrote. It began at the mercantile, where she went only when supplies forced her hand. She stepped inside with her basket held close and her eyes lowered, already bracing for the sting of passing remarks. But she wasn't quick enough. Maeve Talcott, wrapped in a blue shawl and mischief, leaned toward another woman and spoke in a voice perfectly pitched to be overheard. "That's the wrong sister, you know. Dustin McCade was supposed to get the pretty one." The words struck Georgia's spine so sharply, she almost dropped her flour sack. She kept walking, pretending her heartbeat wasn't pounding against her ribs like a trapped animal. But Maeve wasn't finished. "Imagine," she continued, "expecting beauty and getting, well, her." Laughter fluttered behind Georgia like cruel birds. She didn't look back. She paid for her items with trembling fingers and stepped outside, letting the sunlight hit her face with a kind of mercy she didn't feel she deserved. The worst part wasn't the insult. It was that every part of her feared it was true. She took the long road home, hoping the wind would dry her eyes before Dustin saw them. He had never been unkind, but she didn't want him to see that she'd been wounded on his behalf. She didn't want him to feel responsible for something she could endure on her own. As she approached the house, she saw Dustin repairing a broken fence post, hammer in hand, sweat darkening his collar. He paused when he noticed her, something tightening in his expression. Not suspicion, not anger, just a quiet awareness, as though he sensed she was trying to hide something. "You're back later than usual," he said. "Long line at the mercantile," she lied. Her voice cracked despite her effort. She hoped he wouldn't hear it. But Dustin's eyes were the kind that absorbed the world without missing much. He didn't press her for the truth, he only nodded, his gaze lingering a moment too long, as if cataloging a bruise he couldn't yet see. Georgia hurried inside, grateful for the familiar rhythm of cooking. She kept her back straight, her hands moving swiftly through the motions, washing vegetables, seasoning stew, setting bread to rise, trying to bury the mercantile's laughter beneath layers of routine. But the words followed her like shadows, whispering that she would never be enough for this life, this home, or this man. Supper simmered when Dustin finally entered the kitchen. He washed his hands and leaned against the counter, watching her as though studying a map whose meaning he had just begun to decipher. "You've been working hard," he remarked. "It keeps things steady," she replied. "Steady isn't always the same as fine." Her hands paused mid-stir. She didn't respond. Dustin exhaled, a sound tired and weighted. "If someone gave you trouble in town, you can tell me." She shook her head too quickly. Nobody did. She didn't want to be a burden. She didn't want him to feel he had to defend her. And she certainly didn't want to give Maeve more fuel for her gossip. But Dustin's eyes narrowed just slightly. Not in anger, more in realization. He wasn't a talkative man, but he understood silence better than most. When supper was ready, they sat opposite each other. Dustin ate slowly, as though tasting more than the food. Georgia kept her gaze on her plate, praying the red around her eyes wasn't noticeable in the lamplight. Halfway through the meal, Dustin reached into his pocket and set something beside her plate. A small spool of thread, newly purchased. "For mending," he said softly. "Saw you were running low." Her breath caught. It was such a simple thing. A spool of thread. But nobody in her life had ever noticed her needs, unless it was to point out how she failed to meet them. She touched the spool with shaking fingers. "Thank you." "It's nothing." It wasn't nothing. It was kindness. A gesture that slipped past her defenses and settled into a place inside her she had long believed was hollow. After supper, Dustin stepped outside to finish his fence work, while Georgia scrubbed dishes under warm water. The rising moon cast silver light across the yard, and she found herself drawn to the window. She watched him lift another post, his movements steady and sure, his silhouette outlined against the darkening horizon. Her breath softened as she watched him. This man who never demanded, never mocked, never used his strength to make others small. He had his own ghosts, but he didn't haunt others with them. She wondered briefly what it would feel like to be someone he chose willingly. The thought frightened her. It felt dangerous to hope. When Dustin finally came inside, the air between them shifted. Gentle, tentative, charged with something she didn't dare name. He paused at the threshold, removing his gloves, his eyes flicking to hers as if drawn by instinct. "You did a good job with supper," he said. She smiled faintly. "It's what I'm here for." His brow creased, almost imperceptibly. "I don't want you thinking that's all." Before she could ask what he meant, a sudden gust of wind rattled the windows, breaking the moment. Dustin reached for a lantern. "Storm blowing in," he said. "Might want to stay close to the house tonight." Georgia nodded, though her pulse was fluttering for reasons that had nothing to do with weather. She turned toward the darkened hallway, feeling the weight of his gaze following her. Not heavy, not demanding, simply there. Like a promise beginning to form where neither of them dared to speak it yet. The storm that night clawed at the windows like some restless spirit, rattling the shutters until Georgia wondered if the whole house might lift and blow across the plains. She sat on the edge of her small bed, blanket wrapped around her shoulders, listening to the thunder roll like heavy wagon wheels across the sky. Every flash of lightning illuminated the room in sharp silver, momentarily turning her shadow into something bold and unfamiliar before darkness swallowed it again. She had grown up with storms, but loneliness always made them feel twice as loud. 2 months in this house had taught her Dustin was not the kind of man who feared weather, yet she couldn't shake the thought that he too must hear the storm differently tonight. Something in the way he'd watched her walk down the hallway earlier, quiet, thoughtful, as though trying to understand the storm inside her, had left her breathing unevenly. Unable to sit still, Georgia rose and stepped into the dim hallway. The lantern Dustin had left burning cast a small but steady glow. She followed it to the kitchen, drawn more by instinct than need. The room felt warm in contrast to the violent sky outside. A kettle sat on the stove, still holding the faint warmth of supper. She didn't expect to find him there. Dustin sat at the table, his elbows on his knees, head bowed slightly. The storm's glow flickered across his face, carving out the lines of a man who had lived through things he didn't speak of. His shirt was loose at the collar, sleeves rolled up, revealing forearms marked by scars that told their own quiet stories. Georgia froze, unsure whether to retreat or step forward. Before she could decide, Dustin lifted his head. "You're awake," he said softly, almost in surprise. "The storm," she whispered. "It's loud tonight." He nodded. Loud night for thinking too. Something in the way he said it made her chest tighten. She stepped inside, closing the door gently behind her, though the wind still roared through the cracks. Dustin gestured to the chair across from him. "Sit if you'd like." She sat, hands folded tightly in her lap, fingers trembling from more than cold. Dustin watched her with the patience of a man who understood silence better than any spoken comfort. He poured warm water into 2 mugs, dropped tea leaves in each, and slid one toward her. "You don't have to drink it," he said, "but it might help." When their fingers brushed as she reached for the mug, her breath stalled. Dustin drew his hand back slowly, as though aware of the spark but unwilling to frighten it away. Outside, the storm cracked open again. Inside, Dustin spoke first. "You were hurt in town," he said. Not a question. A truth he had pieced together quietly. Georgia swallowed, the heat of the tea warming her palms. "It wasn't anything that matters." "It matters if it cut you." She shook her head, eyes dropping to the table. "People say things. They always have. Doesn't mean you should bear them alone." His voice carried a weight that settled deep within her. She took a shaky breath. "They think I tricked you. That you expected Willow." "And did I ever say that to you?" he asked gently. "No," she admitted. "But they're not entirely wrong. Willow was the one hired. I was the one sent. That wasn't your doing." "But it's my burden," she whispered. For a long moment, Dustin didn't move. Then he leaned forward, elbows on the table, the lantern light carving warm shadows across his jaw. "You've worked every day since you came here," he said. "You steady this house. You steady me. And you never once asked for more than what you were given. Anyone who can't see your worth has no business speaking your name." Georgia blinked hard, feeling her throat tighten. No one, not her father, not her sister, not a single soul, had said such a thing to her. She didn't know how to hold it without breaking. A sudden loud crack of thunder shook the walls. Instinctively, Georgia flinched. What surprised her was Dustin standing, moving to her side without hesitation, placing a hand gently on her shoulder. Not gripping. Not claiming. Simply grounding her. Her breath trembled. "Storm'll pass," he murmured. "They always do." She nodded, but the warmth of his hand lingered deeper than just skin. He hesitated before withdrawing it, as though something in him wasn't ready to let go. When he sat back down, the air between them felt changed. Less distance, more unspoken questions. "You don't have to stay here forever," she said suddenly, the words escaping before she could stop them. "If you want someone more fitting, I'd understand." Dustin's jaw tightened. "Georgia, look at me." She did. "You are not a mistake." Her breath hitched so sharply, she had to press her hand to her chest to steady it. She searched his eyes for doubt and found none, only a sincerity that scared her more than the storm. Before she could respond, the wind howled again, pushing rain against the windows like shattered pebbles. But neither of them moved this time. Dustin's gaze drifted down to her hands, still trembling around the warm mug. He reached out halfway, then paused, as if giving her the choice. Georgia, heart unsteady and unsure, placed her hand lightly into his. It was the smallest gesture. Yet it felt like choosing sunlight after a lifetime of shadows. They sat like that for a long moment, saying nothing while the house shuddered around them. When the thunder finally rolled away into the distance, Dustin released her hand slowly, as though afraid to break whatever fragile thread had formed. "You should rest," he whispered. "You too." But neither of them moved for several breaths. When she finally rose, turning toward the hallway, she felt his eyes follow her again. That same quiet, searching gaze from nights before. Only now it held something new. Not just noticing her. Needing her. And Georgia, for the first time in her life, walked away wondering if a storm had not merely passed, but begun to change the shape of everything it touched. The morning after the storm dawned strangely quiet, as if the sky itself were holding its breath. Mist clung low across the fields, softening every fence post, every blade of grass, every footstep Georgia took as she headed toward the pump to fetch water. Her palms still carried the memory of Dustin's hand from the night before. Its warmth, its steadiness, the way he'd waited for her to choose him back, even in something as small as a shared touch. She had barely slept. Not from fear. From possibility. But daylight carried a different courage than darkness. And by morning Georgia felt the weight of doubt settle across her shoulders again. Dustin was kind. That much she could believe. But kindness and wanting were two different worlds. She had spent her whole life learning the difference. As she filled the bucket, she sensed movement behind her. Dustin approached with slow steps, his hair still damp from washing, sleeves rolled to his elbows. The early sun caught in his stubble, turning him into something both rugged and unreal. "Morning," he said. "Morning," she echoed, trying not to clutch the bucket too tightly. He studied her with that quiet, searching gaze she was learning to decipher. "You rested at all?" "A little." "You seemed shaken." "By the storm," she almost said. "By you," her heart whispered. She nodded instead. Dustin nodded back, the silence between them layered with unfinished thoughts neither dared to speak. Back in the kitchen, Georgia sliced vegetables for stew, while Dustin repaired a loose hinge on the back door. He worked close enough that she could feel the warmth of his presence, but far enough that she could pretend her breath wasn't uneven. Their peaceful rhythm shattered when hoofbeats thundered into the yard. Georgia stiffened. Dustin's posture changed instantly, shoulders rising, jaw tightening. He stood and moved toward the door with the wary instinct of a man who had seen trouble ride in before. Maeve Talcott's voice sliced through the air even before she dismounted. "I need a word with you, Dustin McCade." George's stomach dropped. Maeve stormed toward the house, skirts swishing like angry wings, face flushed with purpose. Two townsfolk lingered behind her, pretending they weren't there to gawk. Dustin stepped out onto the porch. "If this is about supplies," he said coolly, "it can wait." "It's not about supplies," she snapped. "It's about deception." Georgia sank lower behind the kitchen doorway, shame already crawling up her spine like cold fingers. Maeve jabbed a finger toward the house. "You hired one sister and got the other. Folks are talking. They say she planned it. That she came here to trap you." Dustin's voice turned to steel. "No one trapped me." "Oh? Then why didn't she correct the mistake? Why isn't the right sister here? Why is the plain one the one in your home?" The words punched through Georgia harder than any slap. Dustin took a step forward, anger simmering in his eyes. "Watch your tongue." Maeve smirked. "So it's true. You're protecting her. I wonder what the town will say about that." Georgia couldn't listen anymore. Panic, shame, dread. Everything she had always feared about being seen burst open inside her. She slipped out the back door and into the yard, her breath ragged, hands trembling. The world felt too loud, too bright. She didn't want Dustin defending her. She didn't want gossip destroying his name. She didn't want to be the burden Maeve insisted she was. She reached the barn, leaning against the wooden wall, wiping at the tears she hated giving anyone the power to draw. She didn't hear Dustin approach until his shadow stretched long beside hers. "Georgia," he said, breath tight from anger. "You didn't need to run." She shook her head, unable to lift her gaze. "You shouldn't have to defend me." He stepped closer. "I'm not defending you because I have to. People will think. I don't care what they think." She looked up at him then, startled by the intensity in his voice. Dustin's chest rose and fell with unspoken fury, not at her, but for her. "You don't deserve that kind of talk," he said. "Not from Maeve. Not from anyone." Georgia wrapped her arms around herself. "But it's not untrue. Willow was the one you hired. I'm not who you expected. I'm not even who people think belongs here." "Maybe people don't know much," he countered quietly, "about belonging. Or worth." Her throat tightened painfully. "Dustin, you don't have to say things just to make me feel better." He took another step, close enough that she could see the storm still lingering in his eyes. "I don't say things I don't mean." She couldn't breathe. Couldn't think. She could only stand there, heart pounding like a scared animal, while the man before her looked at her, as though she were something he'd been trying to see clearly for a long time. "Georgia," he said, voice gentler now. "You matter to this home, too." He didn't finish. Perhaps he couldn't. A wind swept between them, stirring loose straw across the ground. Georgia swallowed, barely finding her voice. "I don't want to ruin your name." "You won't. Maeve thinks. Maeve thinks noise is power." He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "We don't have to live by her noise." Her breath shivered out. She had heard kindness before, but never spoken like this, steady, unwavering, offered freely. For one fragile moment, the space between them felt charged with something fierce and tender, something that trembled at the edges of becoming real. Dustin opened his mouth as if to speak again, but a distant sound broke the moment. Hoofbeats. Fast. Approaching. Both turned toward the sound, scanning the road. A lone rider emerged from the dust, galloping hard toward the ranch with urgency that chilled the air. The rider shouted Dustin's name. Georgia felt her heart grip tight. Because whatever came next was going to change everything. The rider slid from his horse before it had even stopped moving, his breath wild, his coat dusted with sweat and road grit. "Dustin, trouble in town," he gasped. "Folks are saying things, ugly things." Maeve stirred him up. "Some want the sheriff to question your living arrangements." Georgia felt the words like a blow to the ribs. She stepped back instinctively, as though distance might shield Dustin from the weight of her presence. But Dustin didn't flinch. He nodded once, jaw tight, then turned to her with a gaze carved in calm determination. "Stay inside," he said gently. But Georgia shook her head. "I won't hide. Not from something I caused." He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "You didn't cause this." The rider hesitated, glancing between them. "Dustin, they're saying you took advantage." "That she," he faltered, unwilling to repeat the venom. "You ought to get ahead of it." Dustin exhaled slowly, the sound edged with resolve. "I'll handle it." But George's shame surged up like a tide. "If I leave now it ends. No more rumors. No more trouble for you." Finally, her fear had words. Dustin stared at her, stunned. Not by the idea of losing her, but by how easily she believed she should disappear. "Georgia," he said, stepping forward. "I'm not losing you. Not because of town noise. Not because someone decided you aren't enough. You deserve peace," she whispered. "You are peace," he answered. Her breath broke. Before she could speak, he gently took her hand. Steady, certain, the way a man picks up something precious he refuses to drop. Then he turned to the rider. "Tell them the truth," Dustin said. "Tell them Georgia Whitlow isn't just my cook or some charity case. Tell them she's the woman I'm going to marry." Georgia froze. The words filled the air like a sunrise, soft, blazing, irreversible. The rider blinked. "You're serious?" Dustin didn't look away from her. "More than I've ever been." Georgia's lips parted, her breath catching on a single trembling gasp. "Dustin, you don't have to do this for my sake. I'm doing it for mine." The world seemed to tilt. The storm inside her, shame, doubt, unworthiness, broke apart like clouds pierced by sudden light. Dustin sank to one knee in the dust, not grandly, not with any practiced romance. Simply honestly, as a man offering truth with both hands. "Marry me," he said. "Not to fix anything. Not to silence anyone. Marry me because I want a life built beside yours." Tears blurred her vision. Her voice came fragile but true. "Yes. Dustin, yes." He stood, pulling her into his arms, holding her as though anchoring both of them to something steadier than the shifting world. By nightfall, Sheriff Boone officiated under the cottonwood tree. Their vows were quiet, whispered more to each other than the witnesses. Later, as dusk wrapped the ranch in gold, Georgia looked up at her new husband and felt something she had never known. Belonging. Chosen, finally. And as a soft wind rustled the leaves above them, she wondered. Not with fear, but wonder. What beautiful storms tomorrow might bring.